On June 4th, 2008, Travis Alexander, a salesman, was killed at his home in Mesa, Arizona. His murder and the subsequent criminal trial have received widespread media attention. Alexander's injuries consisted of multiple stab wounds, a slit throat, and a shot to the head. The medical examiner ruled his death a homicide. Jodi Arias, Alexander's ex-girlfriend, was charged with his murder, and her trial began on January 2nd, 2013. Arias testified that she killed Alexander in self-defense. She was found guilty of first-degree murder on May 8, 2013. The case gained significant attention from the news media and was considered by many as an example of both trial by media and a media circus. Alexander's body was discovered in a shower at his house. His throat had been cut. As well, he had been shot in the head and stabbed multiple times. There have been conflicting reports over the number of stab wounds. Some reports said it was 29 stabs. Others said 27. And after the verdict, some believed it was more than 20. Jodi Arias, she preceded the trial, was convicted. And the government, the prosecutor, Juan Martinez, in his opening argument on January 2nd, 2013, he sought the death penalty. Arias was represented by appointed counsel, Kirk Nurmi, and Jennifer Wilmot, who argued that Alexander's death was a justifiable homicide that was committed in self-defense. The penalty phase in this trial began on May 16, 2013, when prosecutors called Alexander's family members to offer victim impact statements in an effort to convince the jury that Arias' crime merited a death sentence. On May 21, 2013, Arias offered an allocution, during which she pleaded for a life sentence. Arias acknowledged that her plea for life was a reversal of remarks she made to a TV reporter shortly after her conviction, when she said she preferred the death penalty. "Each time I said that, I meant it, but I lacked perspective," the former waitress said. "Until very recently, I could not imagine standing before you and asking you to give me life." She said she changed her mind to avoid bringing more pain to members of her family who were in the courtroom. At one point, she held up a white t-shirt with the word survivor written across it, telling the jurors that she would sell the clothing and donate all proceeds to victims of domestic abuse. She also said she would donate her hair to the Locks of Love while in prison, and had already done so 3 times while in jail. In the end, Jodi Arias was sentenced to life. Life in prison. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Blood on the Razor Wire TV, where we bring it to you real and we bring it to you raw. Hit that subscribe button, hit the like button. We got a special guest on today. Many of you might have heard of him. Kirk Nurmi represented Jodi Arias in that Jodi Arias trial. He was a criminal defense attorney, good legal mind, and I like to bring different people on to get different perspectives. So that's why we have this guy on today. Kirk, tell the people who you are and talk a little bit about you, if you can.
Sure. I graduated law school in 2000. I moved to Phoenix when the area was kind of booming. There's a lot of growth in Phoenix, and I was able to get a job right out of law school. I went to law school with the idea of being a public defender because I don't believe that the quality of your defense that you get if you're accused of a crime should really vary if you have a lot of money or don't have very much at all. So I went to law school with that idea. I served in an appellate clinic in Wyoming my 3rd year and kind of hit the ground running here in Phoenix, like I said, when it was booming in 2000. And I was a regular old public defender for several years, about 8 years, and started looking for different paths I could take my career. And about that time, an opportunity to work in the death unit opened up. And I personally, for moral reasons and reasons of government restraint, I'm not a fan of the death penalty. So when an opportunity to work in the death penalty unit opened up, and this was at a time in Maricopa County where, lots of people are familiar with the death penalty in Texas, and always has that reputation. Some counties in Texas have the reputation of being big death penalty type locations. but Maricopa County, where Phoenix is located, was starting to rival that. In 2008, we had a county attorney who had written papers advocating the return of public stoning and things like that when he was in law school. So we had quite a battle on our hands in terms of the death penalty. And so I decided to become a part of that unit. And about a year and a half later, that led to a day in August of 2009 when I was handed an empty file folder with the name Jodi Arias on it, having no idea who she was, or really, obviously they were all first-degree murders in the death penalty unit, but having known nothing about the case really other than that. So that's where people know me from, because ultimately it became a high-profile trial, a case I tried to get out of because I began to get burned out on the death penalty cases. They were very taxing on me personally. But unfortunately, the court ordered that I keep that case. And so most people know me from my time as her attorney. And maybe some people have seen me on Court TV and Law and Crime Network, places like that since then. So totally revised my life since leaving the law really in 2015 and working on my battle with cancer, focusing on that and rebuilding my life.
Well, the Jodi Arias case was a big case. I remember I actually watched the trial. When you first meet her, right? Do you go in there like, I really want to help this? Forget about the law stuff. Do you go in there like, man, did you feel bad for her when you walk in there and she's probably upset? I mean, I've been to prison. I spent 18 years of my life there. And I know what it's like to be in the county jail and to see guys and women, facing big time. Did you go in there and feel bad for her? Or was it just strictly the law?
Well, it's almost strictly law. And keep in mind, I didn't know very much about the case. So you don't know, you can be more empathetic to people depending on the situation, right? And, I look at the job of a capital defense attorney as more often than not the person accused of a crime that the state seeking death penalty is if they're guilty. So my job is kind of almost like, I use the analogy of a surgeon getting someone on a table in an emergency room in a life-saving situation, right? They're not investigating their past. They don't necessarily have sympathy for the person. Maybe they do, but they're there to do a job, right? And that's job one, is to save that person's life. So that's ultimately the approach I take. A lot of people that are accused of a crime want an attorney that sympathizes with them or empathizes with them. But my ultimate job was not to get entangled in my clients, but do the best service I can, right? So just like that surgeon on the table, if they felt sorry for a person, they might be on their game as much as they would be if they were just going about their business. And my job as an attorney is to go about their business, not to be somebody's friend. May sound harsh to some people, but that's ultimately the reality, because the client is there to get the best service possible, not have a best friend that says goodbye as they go off to death row.
I understand. I read the book Just Mercy by Brian Stevens, right? And it seemed like, he does a lot of good work down there in Alabama, and it seemed like he had some personal relationships with his clients where he actually felt bad. I remember in one part of the book, I'm not sure if you read it, but, he's listening to it and, they kill someone and he starts to weep in the car. And that's why I asked you that, because sometimes criminal defendants, sometimes people make bad choices, right? Irrational, irresponsible choices. And then when they get in the county jail and they're facing the time, they're like, wow, I'm not really this person. How could I possibly, do something like this? And some criminal defendants are looking for some sympathy. They are looking for a lawyer to say, hey, you're going to be all right. But I understand your position. Your position was, hey, I want to go out here and try to help save some lives, right?
Yeah, and I think there's a difference. Like I say, I think there's cases that call for that kind of connection, where that kind of connection is established, and other cases where it's not. There's certainly, those cases where you feel someone's wrongly accused or overcharged or something like that, or they are a person that just made a mistake, right? And you want to mitigate the impact of their life. But again, to me, and I haven't read the book you referenced, but my job is to do the best objectively. I figure if I look at a case objectively, like if I just blindly believe a client and there's that connection there, and that doesn't serve them any good at the end. Like there's people I've had on videotape that are clearly guilty of the crime and just want me to share their belief that they're not going to get convicted, right? And I don't believe that that does them any good when they're on the videotape. And that's kind of the point I'm making. And I certainly, and you mentioned this guy being a death penalty attorney. If there's people that do habeas cases after conviction, right, post-conviction relief, some things of that nature, people can wind up having a long-term relationship with the death penalty client, especially in that post-conviction setting. So a connection can grow, right? But when you're talking about trial level attorney, that's maybe a year or two. And I really think my opinion is that objectivity serves me best, because if I'm your friend and you're charged with a crime and I really want to support you, that may make you feel better when you're in jail and say, oh my God, that my lawyer believes in me, all this stuff. But wouldn't you rather be walking out the door? Wouldn't you rather be having a attorney who delivers less impact? That's the kind of attorney that I fancied myself to be.
No problem with that. I think that criminal defendants feel like, hey, I just want someone to care about me when they're facing the death penalty, facing a life sentence. And I'm sure there were plenty of times where, people seen Jodi in the spotlight, but and there was allegations made throughout the trial to, support her defense. And I read some of it, watched the trial. But I'm sure there was a point where she was back in her cell on numerous occasions. And I can tell you this from experience because I was sentenced to 40 years at the age of 24 in federal prison. I'm sure there were plenty of times where she sat on her bunk and rubbed her head and said, wow. And she knew. I mean, the people knew. She knew she was probably going to be found guilty. Maybe she was hoping for a manslaughter, but I'm sure there were plenty of nights where, she regretted some of the decisions that she made. Do you feel that way?
Well, that's one of those questions I don't think I should speak to with the case still pending in post-conviction relief and privilege. So,
okay, not a problem. I respect that. So now you're working in the death penalty clinic. You're doing these death penalty cases. You say it becomes taxing. I can only imagine what it's like for a criminal defense attorney to have to represent people. And, you probably lose a lot more than you win, right?
Well, like I said earlier, yeah, the death penalty cases are the type of cases where victory means a life sentence, not a death sentence. Because more often than not, now there's rare exceptions to this that come in the media and things of that nature, but there's more often than not, the person is guilty of the crime of the murder, because that, the state doesn't pursue the death penalty if the evidence is shaky. And going back to kind of tie in what you said earlier, about, a kinship with the client, but there's also that reality that with most cases anyway, and you talk about the pressure, is that no matter who that person is and what they've done, the client, the defendant, they're always somebody's son or daughter or brother or sister. And so there's that kind of pressure there. And those people are looking at you to save their loved one's life, right? So that's where a lot of the pressure lies. Obviously, there's just from a legal standpoint, a death penalty attorney is required to investigate a client, a defendant's life in session to the time that they are sentenced. So that in and of itself, as you can imagine, creates an onerous burden in a lot of cases, going back to get grade school records, going back to talk to people about whether or not they drank or smoked while they were pregnant with the defendant. So there's certainly a lot of onerous work to it and a lot of contact with the family who is looking at the attorney to save their loved one's life, because that's all they really want.
I understand that. Tell the people how many hours do you put in a week on a death penalty case, because it's taxing. I want people to know how hard you do work on that side.
Boy, a lot of times it would be 12, 14-hour days when you're in trial. It certainly gets that way. When you're in trial, it's 12 to 14 hours a day, probably 7 days a week. If you're lucky, only 6. So it really is taxing, even in those months leading to trial. And, the shortest death penalty trial I had lasted 3 months, right? And so that's 3 months of 12-hour days, 12 to 14-hour days, almost every day. Even the lead up to that, when you're consulting with your experts and everything. And, in the cell phone era, you can't really check out, because you don't have office hours anymore. So you can always look at your email and your experts are talking to you and you're talking to your co-counsel and everything else. So it's a very involved process, which is why after 2 trials, a lot of people in the capital unit went over a decade without having a trial, and I had 2 in 2 years, and that was even before Arias started. So, yeah, it can be very taxing, and like I often say, or said in my books, I believe the Arias trial and that 2.5 years I spent in the spotlight and the harassment and everything I got for it is the reason why cancer entered my life in 2015.
Wow, unbelievable that this job turns into you ending up with cancer, and I read some of your stuff where you were struggling with that. Have you beaten it?
Yeah, the cancer diagnosis came a few months after Miss Arias was sentenced in April of 2015. So in August of 2015 is when the diagnosis happened. I knew right away, sometimes certain things in your heart, Chad, and I knew right away that the stress involved in representing Miss Arias was the reason cancer infested my life, my body, and that meant 6 rounds of chemotherapy. And I, kind of went to a dark place. Did I want to go through chemotherapy? I mean, I was no longer in love with the practice of law. There's obviously probably some PTSD there from everything I went through, and really wondered what my life was going to be like. And I made the choice to, step away from the law ultimately when the bar took issue with me imposing truth upon Miss Arias's lies about me. So, I ultimately decided that I wanted to pursue a life that would make me happy, that I didn't fight in the chemo chair for more years on this planet simply to go back and do the things I've been doing. So that's when I made a big shift in my life towards happiness and joy, doing things that bring me joy, like talking to you here today and doing other legal commentary instead of working those 14-hour days. And life has certainly got better as a result of that. And I'm healthy. I've been cast on a fitness show recently. And so, things are good. Started acting, doing all kinds of different things. So, having lots of fun with life now in different ways.
I can say this. I appreciate you and I appreciate the work that you do because I'm against the death penalty as well. I'm sure that you ever have a case where the guy ended up getting the death penalty?
Yeah, I had one case in that. It was my first trial. I was the co-counsel in that case. And I remember distinctly, and I talk about this. I have a one-man show that I call Overcoming Jodi Arias, and I talk about the effects going through the trial. And one of the stories I tell during the show is about the one time a death penalty verdict was entered into the courtroom. And I remember the client, he had a long criminal history. There's no doubt about it, but he had the kind of background, if you will, childhood and things like that would make that understandable without going into detail. It was very, very horrific. And, he had 3 sisters, 3 surviving sisters that had endured that with them. They didn't have a father, and he was kind of like their father figure. And I remember when that verdict was read, you can tell the jury doesn't look at a criminal defendant. That means they're probably going to deliver him bad news. And given his criminal history and given that he killed 2 people, I suspected bad news was coming. And I remember the moment the death rang out, and I remember hearing the sisters, my client sisters, just scream. They were different screams. They were like they echoed from their soul. It was like all kinds of pain and childhood and their trauma release. And I saw the jurors crying, and I saw the judge disheveled. And because as a professional, you're trying to keep it together. And I took the chance to look over at the families where the victims were seated, and kind of you assume that they would have been happy about the verdict, but they had solemn looks on their faces as well as those cries bounced off the walls of the room. And it was that moment, and this was before I was assigned Jodi's case, that I made a promise to myself that I would do whatever I could to make sure that no client of mine and that kind of pain was never introduced while I was a capital defense attorney on the case.
So it's easy to say that you probably went home that night and didn't sleep well, right?
Well, yeah, that's probably the case, and it certainly was one of those things that, when I think about that moment and I tell that story, it's one of those moments that stay fresh in you, that stick with you, because that was probably, 2009, And here we are 12 or 13 years later, and I can still kind of hear that and still kind of feel that every time I tell the story. It's one of those kind of experiences.
Understandable. So there's probably some young guys that are watching the show tonight. And, I don't know if you know, but I spent 18 years of my life in prison. I worked in the law library. I was what some people would call a jailhouse lawyer, quote unquote. I've done a lot of cases. I've won a lot of cases. I've been successful on a lot of post-conviction cases from prison. And there's some young dudes or young guys out there right now watching this show, and I've seen it plenty of times where people make bad choices. They go rob a Domino's pizza. I had a guy that robbed a Domino's pizza, and he shoots the people, and he ends up with stack 924Cs. He ends up with like 50 years. I'm sure that you've seen younger men, and some women, but probably not many, where these guys make these dumb choices. They're robbing a Domino's pizza for $200, and now they're going to spend the rest of their lives in prison. Have you seen cases like that as a public defender?
Yeah, certainly, and I see cases like that, or I talk about cases like that when I do my legal analysis work as well. So I see exactly what you're talking about. One of the things I see that is really most common, I think, is this idea of respect or ego, and people acting out of the sense of being disrespected. I bet you saw a lot of that, right? Like guys who are acting, there's a couple cases in the news now. We were talking about off air this, and these are older people, so their thinking should even be better, more mature, right? This movie house where the guy's texting and the guy confronts him, the 71-year-old man confronts him, and then the guy throws a bag of popcorn. The guy texting throws a bag of popcorn at him, and the 71-year-old retired detective shoots him and kills him. And there's cases like all over. There was a road rage, or like road rage incidents are big, right? You might have saw a lot of that, especially with younger people. There's one coming up now, and people don't think in that moment, right? Their ego, I'm better than you, I'm tougher, you're not going to disrespect me, and they act on that perceived disrespect, right? So instead of using the movie theater, instead of a quiet date day to a movie, you have a 40-something-year-old father of an infant who's dead. His daughter's really never going to, or his child is never really going to know him. And you have a man who's claiming self-defense, and he's going to go up for trial. He's probably going to spend the rest of his life in prison, because I don't think throwing a bag of popcorn at someone is going to be considered, a threat to his life. We'll see what the jury says about it, but it's that sort of thing. And there's all kinds of specifics that play off that sort of thing of I'm tougher than you, I'm better than you, I'm not going to take your crap, and so I'm going to respond to it, right? You see that all the time, especially with the younger people. And sometimes that winds up in a murder, sometimes that winds up in an aggravated assault, and that winds up a lot of years in prison.
There was a case today. I don't know if you're familiar. They got these guys on TikTok. They're making all kinds of money. They're called the Island Boys. They got this crazy hairstyle going. And an 8-year-old gets shot the other day in Florida. I think the 8-year-old gets shot. They chase this guy, or they got word that he's at the house with these kids, and he's just 21, 22 years old, and they arrest him. He killed an 8-year-old kid in Florida. Good possibility that could be a death penalty case. And this is just another example of, I think they were probably having some kind of dumb beef. He's shooting at someone and hits an 8-year-old, and now the 8-year-old's dead, and now his life is going to be thrown away as well. So it does happen, and it happens all too frequently, right?
Yeah, and that theme is one of the things I saw consistently. Like you talk about robberies and things like that, those certainly are prevalent, but the most prevalent to me are those ego-driven cases, right? Road rage. Talk about road rage. This person cut me off. This person was hitting on my girl, or whatever it is, and it's all that same kind of theme. Like, I'm not going to be disrespected. But every single person, and this is what I think is so important for those out there in the audience to know, is every single client I had who acted on that feeling of disrespect or ego, or you hurt somebody, I'm going to hurt you, and somebody else gets hurt, is that they all regret it. They all say that it's not worth it. In the end, they say it's not worth it. Whether it's 10 years or 20 years or life, regardless of what the act is, right? If it's a kidnapping, if it's whatever, domestic violence situation, right? We see that a lot in common. My girl disrespected me, et cetera, et cetera. And they're now they're a felon, right? Or, we saw this in the 90-day fiance case, right? I mean, the guy had a rap, but he's bouncing his girlfriend. Why? She wasn't acting a certain way. Maybe she was being what he believed disrespectful. And boom, now he's doing 18 years, I think it is. And do you think he regrets that? Yeah. And so, and I'm sure you heard it in prison. The guys that were honest with you would say, "Yeah, I regret it. Yeah, that was stupid shit that I did." And that needs to resonate with those people out there that are in your audience or what have you, to say, "Yeah, this is stupid shit. It ain't gonna mean anything a week from now." Somebody cutting you off on the freeway ain't gonna mean anything a week from now, but it will mean something for the rest of your life if you act upon that, right? There's a guy in Florida. I don't know if you saw the video. Actually, a buddy of mine, Andy Slater, broke this. The guy cuts in front of somebody, and the guy's got a dash cam video and everything else, and he starts shooting bullets at the side, out his side window, and towards the front of his car, and is calling it self-defense. You think that guy's going to regret what he did if he winds up behind bars for a significant amount of time? Yes, he is.
I don't understand why people make those choices, but I want to ask you this, because I want the people that are watching the show that are involved in a criminal lifestyle to maybe make a change tonight. How many guys, and I'm not asking you, this isn't specifically about Jodi, but working as a death penalty attorney, how many people have told you, "Kirk, I don't want to die, man. I don't want to get the death penalty"? I mean, how many times has that happened?
Well, a lot. There's kind of, you would think that would be the initial response right away, but you've been in prison, that kind of tough guy mentality, right? That people try to present. So a lot of it goes like, yeah, I don't care if I die. Yeah, screw them, screw the government, whatever. But when trial comes closer, and when you get closer to that, then that tone changes, because then it becomes real, right? That posturing that you see, that tough guy posturing that you see, begins to fade, and that reality sets in. And that's the thing that people don't think about when they're ready to pick up that weapon. Going back to the guy in the car, he's not facing the death penalty, but because nobody was killed. But let's say he had shot an 8-year-old in a car. He's shooting bullets on a busy freeway in Florida. He very well easily could have killed a kid in the back of a car. What if he was facing the death penalty, right? I mean, how would he regret his actions? It's taking that moment. And I always think the best advice is, if it ain't gonna mean anything an hour from now or a week from now, then it's probably not worth messing up the rest of your life for.
Sometimes people make bad decisions right off of impulse, and they don't think about the consequences. But when they end up shooting an 8-year-old kid and they're sitting in the county jail now they're on their bunk rubbing their head saying, what did I do? And they start to realize, yeah, it wasn't worth it. A week later, now look at my life. And I do, like what you said, that there's people that are like, I don't care, I didn't do it. I'm good friends with a criminal defense attorney where I'm from right here. Does a lot of big cases. He's got a murder case. They got cameras all over my city now. They got this guy following the guy all the way up to his house. He goes in the house, he kills the guy, comes out, the cameras follow him all the way to his house. And he's telling the criminal defense attorney, it ain't me. It is you. And he's, he's trying to get the guy a deal where he can end up with a 25-year sentence. He's like, nope, I'm going to trial. With a 25-year sentence, he's going to get out. But if he goes to trial, the guy's never getting out of prison. And sometimes people make bad choices, and then they continue to make bad choices once they're in jail. You've seen that 1,000 times.
Yeah, you bet. And it is that moment of reflection, right? And you're right, because people act on impulse. So using this guy in the car as an example, he acted on impulse, got cut off, he was mad, he's going to pull out his gun. But, if we just, and that's part of it, to just think, right? So many times we act and we don't think. If we took that extra half second, say, is this going to mean anything an hour from now or a week from now? odds are the answer is no, and it's probably not worth it. Now, it's hard, you're right, in that moment. Believe me, if I had a magic wand, we wouldn't need this show. We just wave that magic wand and it would, people would stop doing it. And, you're right. And those bad choices can continue. And you mentioned, a kinship with people and everything else. Your friend who's an attorney and trying to get a guy to do 25 years instead of life, that lawyer's not going to be too happy with that client, because, hey, listen, okay, here's, you make your choice, here's your consequences. And that was always my feeling too. I've done all I can for you. I can't, a lawyer can only advise. They can't, make a person do a particular thing. So, that's where the kind of disconnect comes from that I was talking about earlier, because it can be frustrating. So, but yeah, you can only do so much as a lawyer, and we can only do so much here, saying, think before you act. Just that split second could make the difference between a life of freedom and a life in prison.
I want people to also understand this. Once you're in there, I'm sure you've had plenty of clients that think you're a magician, that you're going to come write this phenomenal motion and you're going to find this thing in the discovery that's going to change the course of the case. And a lot of times it doesn't work that way, does it, Kurt?
No, and as you probably know, one of the most valuable commodities to someone in jail is hope that they're going to get out, or the hope that they're not going to get convicted, depending on what stage they are in the process, right? And they reach for that hope, and they create scenarios where that hope is possible. Like you said, there's going to be some motion to quash the, search warrant or something like that. And more often than not, that's just not a reality of the situation there. A lot of people think, oh, if I had a paid lawyer, right? You probably heard that. If I had a paid lawyer, they could get me out. I was videotaped doing what he was doing, saying, well, if I had $100,000, I could hire a lawyer that would get me out of this. I said, no, if you had $100,000, you could hire a lawyer that could tell you he could get you out of this. Then he or she wouldn't, because you're on videotape doing it.
There are some really good federal public defenders and state defenders, right? And yeah, I've heard that 1,000 times. And I tell people, save your money. You got CJA counsel. The same guy that the court appointed to you, or it will be the same guy that you could have hired. You could have hired him for $20,000, $30,000 that your family doesn't have, when this is the same guy that would have been appointed. And I always recommend to people that, hey, you should do your own legal research. You should read your discovery. You should be involved in your case. And unfortunately, like you said, most of the time, and I don't want people to get mad, but most of the time when the police arrest you, or when you got a death penalty case and they're seeking death, they have a pretty solid case. They don't just go pick up people and say, hey, we're gonna give this guy, we're gonna try this guy for a death penalty case. Years ago they've done some bad things to people, and you've seen it, I've seen it, where some people have been convicted that were innocent. I think we've killed people in this country that were innocent. I think we've killed people that had a mental capacity where they shouldn't have been killed. They shouldn't have been facing the death penalty, and we've strapped them to chairs and we've killed them. So I'm definitely against the death penalty, and I'm definitely against people putting cases together against people that are innocent. But a lot of times it doesn't work that way. They're not always innocent, right?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned there are occasions, think about the poor guy in Texas whose family died in an arson, and the arson investigator went in and testified that it was arson. And then years later, after he's been executed, they find out the science that this guy lied on is all junk. And it really was some kind of wiring issue in the home. And so not only did he not get to mourn his loss of his family in a proper way, he was executed for their murder. And that's a penalty you can't go back from. You see constantly a lot of guys, we had one in Arizona, Ray Crone, I don't know if you're familiar with the case, spent about a dozen years on death row off bogus bite mark evidence. But that's the exception, not the rule. That is the 1 in 1,000, 1 in 100,000 type of situation. And you're right, it goes back to what I said earlier, though, right? Hope's such a valuable commodity. So if they see someone who got off death row, they think, well, my attorney should be able to do the same thing. and they don't want to accept anything less, and they don't want to hear the bad news, right? They don't want to hear you're on tape at 7-Eleven robbing the place, or the example you said, the guy being followed all around town, and he doesn't want to accept it's not me, right? I've heard that when it comes to videotape all the time, because they just want to cling to that hope and blame their lawyer or whatever it might be. And it's about kind of responsibility, goes back to that, but not only after you've been arrested, but before, and taking that moment to think about the life you want to live. I mean, what life do you want to live when you're about ready to think about that? Even though you probably don't, it's the only solution is to give it that thought. And it only takes an extra second to say, am I going to care about this in a week? And odds are you won't.
So everybody knows, you do the Jodi Arias trial. You're fighting to save her life, right? Her life is saved, but she's going to spend pretty much the rest of her life in prison, right?
Yes.
If she's not successful on any post-conviction proceeding.
Yes.
And you chalk that up as a win because you did. You saved her life. And I don't know if you can talk about this, but were you afraid? I mean, was there a part in you where you're like, you're in the death penalty phase, death penalty trial, where you're like, they might give her the death penalty? Was there a point where you were worried about it? And that's not going towards her guilt or innocence. I'm asking if you were worried about not being able to save her life.
Well, let me back it up. I mean, that's the concern of every death penalty attorney at every step of the way. There's no surety to any of this, right? I mean, you don't know what the jury's going to do, so you can only do your best. I'm always a fan of Gandhi quote: "Full effort is full victory." So my desire was to make sure that I did full effort, and to me that was victory. And the results, I've really grown to get to a place where I figure I can't control things other than myself, right? And so you can only put so much out there, and the fate of a death penalty client ultimately belongs to the 12 people you put in that box, and no one else. And that's really all a defense attorney can do, because if they try to do more, they'll drive themselves crazy.
And some try to do more. Was she relieved that day?
Say that again, Chad?
Was she relieved when they didn't impose the death penalty? Was she happy? Was there a point where we didn't see on court TV where she was like, "Well, thank God I didn't get the death penalty"?
Well, that goes to some of the privileged communication. So I'm gonna have to punt on that question. Sorry.
Okay, not a problem. So I see a book behind you. I know you. How many books have you put out?
Oh, too many, like 8. I've written a couple on the Jodi Arias trial, and ultimately the one I'm most proud of that I think is kind of goes what we're talking about is called Defend Your Greatness. And it's a book about living our truest self and actualizing the reasons why we were born, living a happy life, a joy-filled life, because so many times in our lives we think that we're going to get the house, the wife, the 2.5 kids, and that's going to result in happiness. And we don't make happiness a priority in our life. So what if we made happiness a priority in our life? And that would also, if people started thinking about being happier, some of these other things would fall by the wayside. They would become less important, right? Some of these criminal activity we see, in criminal activity we talk about, you mentioned kids on the street and they're out there and they're doing things, but we see criminal activity at all levels, right? And like the Elizabeth Holmes, the Theranos founder, who committed a crime that involved millions of dollars and depriving people with the blood test. I don't know if you're familiar with this case or not. It was 100%. A federal trial. And you have to think that, unhappiness was the root of her actions, why she felt like she needed to do those something that was somehow having all that money or whatever came with all that money, prestige of her company, would somehow make her happy. When that ultimately wasn't the reality, right? And that was the reason for her criminality. So, defend your greatness is kind of, none of us are born to rob a 7-Eleven. None of us are born to kill people. So I kind of want people to step back and look at the reasons they were brought here and follow the passions that are within their heart. And that's true of anybody at any point in time. You get out of prison after 18 years, you could have been, and you probably were, resentful, angry, etc., but happy. But given what I know about your life situation and what's happening, you make this choice to start to follow your heart, I think, to start to say, okay, this is what I want to be. This is where I'm at, and this is where I want to be, and start putting that life together, life when you're happy. So, that's the sort of thing that I think is so important in this world. And I kind of weave that into my journey of infamy, the infamy related to representing Jodi Arias and my battle with cancer and having, thinking about my mortality as a reality, right? Because none of us think about that or want to think about that. We think about death as something, oh, we're either going to get hit by a bus and boom, and it's over, or it's something that we're going to have to deal with 30 or 40 years down the road. And, that's just not the case. So what are we going to do with our time here? And it becomes more precious. And certainly, people ask me, am I grateful I had cancer? And my answer is always no, but I'm grateful for the lessons cancer taught me. And that's one of the things I put in the book. And I think they're good lessons for everybody moving forward. You want more happiness in your life, because let's face it, when we talk about the topic of this show, happy people aren't out there committing a lot of crimes. They're enjoying their lives.
That's a good point. I'm going to definitely buy the book. I'll put a link in here and I think other people that watch the show, we do a lot of positive things, and it sounds like a book that a lot of the viewers will probably like to get too. I'm definitely getting the book. What you talked about was, the happiness thing before we get ready to go. And sitting in prison, sure. Some guys used to laugh at me behind my back because I would tell people, man, I'm going to get out and I'm going to have a son and I'm going to coach his baseball team. And some guys will be like, this dude's got 40 years. This dude ain't never getting out. He's going to be 65 when he gets out. What is he talking about? But I always knew what my happiness would be. And I got out of prison. I've been home 19 months. I got remarried to the woman I was married to when I went to prison. Had 2 twin boys. We own a home. And, I'm working on that happiness that I felt makes me happy. Those are the things that make me happy. Other people have different things that make them happy. And at the end of the day, we see a lot of these guys selling drugs and they think their happiness is money and hanging out at the club and doing this. And then when the police come or the federal government arrests them or they catch a murder charge, they're sitting in prison and all that stuff never meant anything. That's not where the true happiness is at. So, I appreciate you coming on the show, Kurt. And I don't know, do you have a message that you can give the young guys that are on the wrong path, young women that are heading down the wrong path before we leave?
Yeah, just think about the choices. Think about the type of life you want to live. Think about things you want to do. Those things that you wanted to do as a kid before you ever thought about going down that wrong path or before you ever started down that wrong path. And understand that there are options. And whatever struggles, whether you're broke and you want money and you want to sell drugs, you want to rob a 7-Eleven or anything else, one of the things I think that we forget is that our situation is temporary. No matter what we go through, most of everything, life is temporary, right? We live, we die. But most of what we go through is temporary. That speaks to kind of what you were saying, like you were in prison and you had these dreams because you were willing to recognize that didn't have to be a permanent state of affairs. Could be a temporary state of affairs, right? And when we start realizing that the state of affairs in front of us is not always how it's going to be, because you look back at your life and that's not always how it was going to be. Before you were Chad the inmate, you were Chad the what have you. Now you're Chad the dad ready to coach baseball, So we go through these different phases in life and we keep thinking that they're permanent. And when you start thinking that they're permanent, that's when you feel trapped in the current situation. If we start recognizing that they're not permanent and that they can change, then there's room for hope. that hope could be towards a different, better life, instead of going down that path where one day you're, a high rolling drug dealer at the casino hanging out with a girl on each arm. The next day you're using a restroom in a cell with 3 guys watching you. So there's a big difference there, but we start thinking about the permanency of our joy and protecting that, no matter where you're at in life, whether you're Elizabeth Holmes or a kid on the street. We start thinking about it that way, then the incentive to, commit a crime is a lot less.
For sure. I'm going to close this show and just let you know again, man, I appreciate you coming on. Appreciate your insight. I hope that it's helpful to people, and I hope it strikes a chord. And I'm sure that no matter what people say, I believe that, when people talk, people listen. And maybe today, maybe this is the one where someone says, you know what? I don't want to keep living like this, because I don't want to be, the guy using the bathroom in front of 3 people. So I'm going to close the show, tell people, man, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, share the video. Someone needs to hear it. With respect, until tomorrow, we're out.